James, good to see you, brother. It's been actually not so long since we saw each other in person. You were here in Miami having a good old time, and it was awesome to connect with you. But we've been actually friends for many years. I would consider you one of the OG sales minds in the sales tech space. And if you think about sales tech as it exists today, it's actually pretty young. Yeah, like CRM has been around arguably since the late 70s or so with, the various solutions out there, Siebel and uh, I'm blanking on a couple of those, Goldmind, right? Some of those other ones. But sales tech as it exists today is what, 15 years old, something like that.
I don't even know if we could give it that much. I mean, we're talking. I mean, that would put us in 2009, and I mean, I think that's still like the years Marketo and was still just kind of taking off, right? Marketing automation was just still taking off in like 2009. So if I think about sales tech, I'm going to say 2014, 2015,
Yeah,
right?
certainly as it exists today, absolutely, right?
Yeah.
And you mentioned Marketo, and there was Silver Pop, and HubSpot jumped on the game too and really did some very interesting things from a marketing perspective. And now I think they're really making a lot of headway with their CRM product, and yeah, they've just done incredible things. But I remember going and pitching a startup that I was working on back. This was late 2010, early 2011.
Yeah.
And I was like, no, telling these venture capital investors, like, no, there are like sales tools. And they would be like, oh, but these email things, like, this is all like marketing automation. There's already Marketo and all these other tools. And I was like, no, it's a different user. And I was positioning it as an inside sales tool. But anyways, and that was in 2011. And now, for you VCs out there who were telling me I was wrong, uh, not that I know anything from anything, but at least I think I was right on that one. But anyways, thanks for joining us on the show, James. Why don't you take a quick second just to give us a quick background on yourself and your career?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember. I mean, just thanks for the humbling introduction too, as well. I think it's I go back. I had a lot of, when I first came onto the scene, when I really started to kind of focus on some of the like the sales tech kind of world. There was a lot going on, and I had a lot of respect for a lot of you that were kind of in it for a couple of years already, and just kind of doing that old school hustle. But me in particular, I think we all have our own path. We all have our own journey, right? I didn't get into tech sales until I was 32, right? I worked in the restaurant business pretty much since I was 16. So I was a full-time bartender. And at one point I just decided that it was time for me to kind of figure out like, what was next? How do I get out of working these weekends, and how do I make enough money to be able to kind of have a more stable lifestyle? And so for me, I decided to go back to school full time, work full time. And when I graduated, I was actually looking at financial services jobs. So I was talking to companies like Merrill Lynch, Wells Fargo, a couple of like family intros and things like that. And as I was kind of going through some of these conversations, I was like, something doesn't feel right. Like, this isn't very exciting to me. Like, there's something that I want that's different. And so actually I called my buddy up, and he was working at a small little startup in San Francisco. And I had done a group project with him through school about the startup that he was working at. And I went to their job, and they had this entry-level sales position called an inside sales analyst. It was 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. every single day. You made 250 dials every single day. You were passing leads. You were calling on content syndication, passing leads to like VoIP telephony companies like Ring Central, 8x8, Vocalocity way back in the day. And that's kind of where I met a lot of people, like just in my network. And so that was kind of my start into B2B tech sales in general. And it was kind of funny. I remember when I got the interview and I called my buddy up, he got me an interview the very next day. And I was like, dude, I have to go buy a suit, right? I was like, I have to show up. This is like my first like big boy job, right? 32 years old. And he's like, you don't need a suit, dude. He's like, you're fine. And I show up the next day. I went to Macy's in the morning. The interview was at like 1:30. I went to Macy's in the morning, got a suit, and showed up, and everybody's in t-shirt and jeans, and hasn't shaved in like 6 months. that kind of stuff. And I was like, oh, this is B2B tech. I was like,
Yeah,
this feels like home, right?
totally. Especially in
So,
the Bay Area, right?
yeah, exactly. So it was like 101 California, right there, right there on the Embarcadero and kind of market right there. So it was pretty cool. It was a fun experience. So, and all those people, that's where I met Craig and Scott.
Yeah.
Two of my mentors today. So, yep,
Shout out to Craig Rosenberg, good
yep,
friend.
yep.
And that reminds me of a story when I was at an incubator building that company with my co-founders that I alluded to earlier, that these venture investors were like saying that wasn't a category, which it would have ended up becoming like Sales Loft, right? Because we started off with like the list building kind of tool thing that, if you remember, Sales Loft started off with, and all that. But in any case, it reminds me of what the director of that incubator told me, because I had just come from New York, right? And in New York, you wore sports coats, and wasn't like a tuxedo or full kind of thing. It was stylish, but I remember having a sports coat, and I walk in and everyone's in like flip flops and t-shirts, and these were other founders.
Yeah.
And I was wearing the CEO role at the time. And what was interesting was the director comes up to me. He goes, man, like that's not how we do it here in Silicon Valley, right? Like you look like one of the VCs that we're trying to have you pitch to. And I just remember that. Shout out to Thomas Corte. But let's dive into a couple of things here as it relates to B2B sales from your perspective as like an OG AE sales leader, sales mind who's still at it now, right? How has B2B sales evolved since you made that transition into the tech industry?
Yeah, I love this question because everybody's kind of like taking a deep look into this right now, right? Everybody's like, what's going on? What's we're in a tech downturn right now. We're feeling it. There's still layoffs. I think across the board, Q1 was pretty much was pretty rough. And so I think the interesting thing to me about like B2B sales in general and how it's evolved. I don't know how much B2B sales has evolved. I think we went through this like golden era of SaaS, where you found that there were just thousands of companies that were built basically overnight. And there was all these people that came from a lot of these bigger companies like the SAPs, the Oracles, the Salesforce of the world. And they tried to bring these cookie cutter processes to companies that weren't ready for it yet, and maybe never were going to be ready for it. And so everybody kind of had this like idea that there was just going to be like, hey, we're going to be 0 to 100 million, right? It was like that seemed like the North Star is like, hey, we're going to get to 100 million in ARR. And without really kind of taking a step back and taking a deeper look into like what their product was, what their product market fit was, what pricing actually looked like for their specific product, what was the value they were actually bringing to the table. And so there was this kind of period of time where it was just a lot of money was just being spent. People were buying things just to see what worked, what didn't work, all of that kind of stuff. And where I think like B2B sales in general is kind of what's happening now is a lot of people are just kind of taking a step back just to the basics, right? And they're just kind of saying, okay, well, how do we just go back? How do we train our reps on business acumen? How do we train them on how to have conversations? How do we train them not to just be sending out a few hundred emails every single day? Like, what is the right mix of like, a cadence or the steps that we need to actually bring into play to actually connect with someone? And I think you're starting to see a little bit of that old school hustle kind of come back, where people are just like, guys like you and me, where it's like, hey, like, let's get out on the street. How do we talk to people in person? How do we have those right conversations? And so I think what we're seeing right now is a lot about just basically taking a step back, really looking at like, hey, what are the basics? What did we miss here? How do we basically come back to a little bit of this, bring a little bit of that old school hustle, start having real conversations again with people, and then how do we actually grow the company from there? What I think is evolving right now is this idea around alignment. People have talked about it for years. And I think this idea around go-to-market alignment, I think that is what is evolving, is like, how do we actually go out there as a team, as a company and an organization to basically make things work and really kind of and really kind of figure out what is the right motion to make sure you're including all of the different departments, and what does it actually look like from a marketing, sales, customer success perspective, and what does that actually look like. So,
Boy, there's so many things to unpack there.
yeah,
But a couple things that come to mind. I was actually thinking last night about outbound and
yeah,
there's been a lot of talk about outbound not working or being dead and all that kind of stuff. And for me, with all due respect to all the great minds who have been chatting about this, however, outbound for me is defined as I, as a human being, professional,
yeah,
going out and going to you as a prospect because I think there's value, right, to what I could provide, or I could help you do X, Y, Z, or reach certain goals, or whatever that sort of value proposition is that I've been able to determine as a professional salesperson, and I've gone out and outbound, right? And so whether that's email or phone or knocking on your door or mailing you a brochure, whatever that is me going out there. So for me, that's the essence of sales, right? Don't get me wrong, right? We all love inbound,
yeah,
right? And it is a unique attribute of an organization. But for me, and maybe this is a bit of a, I don't know, a chip on my shoulder kind of thing because I learned selling going out, literally doing door to door. For me, it was the easier of the two, right? And that outbound has always been hard, by the way, right?
yeah,
It literally, there was never a time where outbound was easy. I don't know that time. Now, maybe it was the last couple of years and I wasn't, carrying a bag or I haven't been an SDR since, whatever decade and a half ago or so, right?
yeah.
So maybe it was easy the last couple of years. I don't know, but I doubt it because it's just never been easy, right? And so that
Yeah, but
hustle.
yeah. Yeah, you bring up a really good point. Sorry to interrupt you, but I mean, if you go back to like some of the early days when like, the bridge school or, some of the early topo research where it was like, how long does it take for you to get in touch with someone? I mean, it was 18 to 22 touches, right? I mean, it was like, it was, how many touches over a certain period of time before you actually got in touch with someone and before you actually had a conversation with them. I mean, this data goes back, years, 10 plus years ago, where there's actual data of like outbound sales and how many touches it actually took to be able to get in someone. And it was a grind. I mean, it's always been a grind, right? And I think that's the thing about sales is we had this period of time where for some reason it seemed like it was a little bit easier, and people forgot that there was this period like before. Sales was never easy, right? It's never been easy. And I think that's the one thing I think that is fascinating about right now, coming back to that idea of outbound, is saying, people are saying outbound is dead, and it's more or less like, is outbound dead, or do we just kind of have to remember that sales has never been easy, outbound has never been easy, and we've got to be able to educate and train the right way based off of like those different components.
Yeah, absolutely. Amen. I mean, that's really what I was thinking through as I was riding my bike on my late night ride, and put together a little LinkedIn post that I'll post a little later because I was just wanting to share my thoughts right on this. And listen, I get it. I know that the amount of noise via email is tough, right? Like, has it increased? I don't know, maybe. Like, it's always been tough. Like, I've always gotten spammed. I'm not sure, right? Do you have to rethink your cadences or sequences or whatever it is that you use to put those touches together? Probably, right? But it's again always been like that, right? The sales was about figuring it out. Sales was about persevering. Part of sales is the day-to-day actual knocking on the door, right? The activity, the actual, let's just call it physical activity, even though for inside sales and specifically tech, it's largely tapping on keys on a computer, right? But let's just say that that's a physical activity, right? Yes, but I think the most intriguing part about sales was my ability to have encounters with this difficulty and persevere and go through that and figure it out. And so that has never changed. And so, anyways, to get off my soapbox here a little bit, but I just when you talked about that hustle earlier, like that's really what was coming to me, and I think that that has always been the case. And I think that we got to go back to that hustle culture, and that's leadership, in my opinion, right? Like, yes, there are certain people who are born with that. They get out of college and they just want to rule the world, and they have that instinctually. And I'd like to say that I was probably like that, right? So like I never had a sales manager when I got into my professional career that not that I didn't respect, but I didn't really learn from, right? Like from in terms of that component, in terms of the hustle component, right? There were other things certainly that I picked up. And not to say that I was special in any way, that's just how I was built. But I would say that there are also sales reps out there who have been developed, who you can help them dive into that grit, dive into that perseverance, and paint the picture for them to be able to understand, hey, yeah, this is sales and this is your job, but you're probably going to be here maybe what, 2 years max, at this point. What can you learn from this role that will help you in life in general, getting through those difficult moments? And I thought that sales has always been a great kind of, I don't want to say playground, but school, right? For life.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's important to note that, you know, the idea that not everybody makes it in sales is, is not a new phenomenon, right? I think they said that there's like 2.5 million sales reps over the last few years, and they're expecting it to drop down to 1 million or something like that, shortly, if it's not already there with all the layoffs, right? And that's okay, right? I mean, and
Sounds about right.
yeah, I mean, it's not for everyone, right? And I think I mean, I had a couple conversations with some people that were, I worked with earlier, and they got out of sales, and when I talked, they're like, I'm getting out of sales, and I was like, dude, that's all. Like, they were going to do their own passion, do a different thing, write a blog or do something else that they wanted to do, and they were a little shocked by my response, and I was like, hey, like, listen, like, this is a hard job. It's not for everyone. Like, you live quarter over quarter. You live, that's how you kind of live. And that's something that I think that, from a leadership perspective, that we have to be able to coach and mentor certain people to say, like, hey, sales isn't for everyone, and that's okay, because it is a grind, it is hard, and some of us instinctively have that kind of second nature to do it, but not everybody has that, right? And so, yeah.
Totally. James, you know who I want? I want the person who I sit down with and say, sales ain't for everyone. It's really, really hard. Most people can't do it. And it is an extremely, extremely emotional experience that you got to deal with on a consistent basis every day. And you might not be made for this. I want the person who looks at me and hears that and goes, F you. I want to do this, right? That is the person, right? I remember when I was in college and we used to recruit people to do this, door to door sales stuff. It's kind of like one of those network marketing things, but a little more respectable because they really did teach you how to do sales. And that was our whole spiel. We knew we'd have like, because we would be like, hey, you want to make 20, 30 grand a summer and not have to flip burgers, right? During your school year, come to this informational, and then we pitch them. But that was the core of our message. Like, this is hard as fuck.
Yeah.
And people don't make it through this thing. They quit, like all the things I just said. And you'd have 100 people in there and you'd be left with 10 people,
Yeah.
right? And of those 10 people, 5 end up actually showing up. And of those 5 people, 3 actually do the work,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
And
And one
but
actually
they
sells out of it, if that, right? Yeah.
yeah. And then we do that all school year long, and we'd end up recruiting
Yeah.
10 people to actually go in the summertime with us to do this stuff. That is what I'm talking about. And that's when you said the hustle, that's what stood out to me. I want that person. I don't want the person who's like, oh my gosh, like that person's just never gonna like succeed, right? They're just like even in life, right? Like I don't want to like speak negatively of those people because maybe they'll figure it out in some other way. But
Yeah.
in terms of sales, that's not the attitude. You need to have that grit. You need to have that edge.
Yeah, no, I was doing some mentoring for some younger college students up by where I live now in Sonoma County, and I met three younger guys, right, and all like all kind of bubbly personalities, and I'm ready to get into sales. And they kind of and based off of the conversations I was having, one of them I was like, okay, dude, when you graduate, you need to get into sales, right? And he did. He went, he hustled to get a job. It was like the hardest time to get a new SDR job. Everybody was getting laid off. He got the job. He's been grinding and gritting like the whole entire time. And a couple of the other guys, like one of the guys was like, he's on the fence. He's like, what am I going to do? Where am I going to go? And I was like, just let it happen naturally, right? He wanted to move down to San Diego, find a job. He did. He's been successful there. But I don't think sales is going to be for him in the future, right? And the other guy didn't go down that path. After talking to me, he's like, I want to go down my music path. That's my passion. That's where I want to go. So it's being able to have those real conversations with people, like to your point kind of a little bit earlier about like being able to have those real conversations with someone to be able to say, what is my path? Is sales right for me? And sometimes sales might be right for somebody in the future. It's just not right for them right now, right? And those are the types of conversations that we all need to be able to have with ourselves or with hopefully a mentor or a leader that we've got, right?
Totally. Well, I
Yeah.
know we went down a different path here. We were really focused on enterprise selling, but you got me so fired up talking about hustle, right? Which you still need, right, in enterprise
Yeah,
selling.
absolutely.
Well, what would you say, just given that you've been focused largely on enterprise selling and are considered one of the top enterprise salespeople in our space? What is unique about enterprise selling versus your experience with like SMB or mid market prospects?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I mean, there's so much you can learn in the SMB mid-market space that help you in the enterprise. There's so many different skill sets that you can learn. SMB mid-market, I was thinking about this a lot last night, is it like a company like Toast, right? Where you might have these SMB sellers who are trying to sell to one restaurant or a couple of different restaurants, that somebody might own or something like that, right? Very transactional type selling. It might be some of that door to door, show up, hey, $5,000, $10,000 deal, super transactional. You can close that with like 30, 60, 90 days, whatever it is. And then you've got mid market, which sometimes maybe you're trying to sell to like 50 to 100 restaurants or something like that. Maybe a chain like Raising Cane's probably isn't the best because they're like one of the fastest growing chains I think right now. But some of these smaller style chains where you might have more like 3 to 6 month style sales cycles. So you've got the reps that are kind of focused on that, right? But if you're trying to sell to Toast, right? If you're trying to sell to them as a large enterprise company, which they're not, there's obviously larger enterprise companies, but you have to understand them as a business, all of the different motions that they have. I mean, I'm very focused on kind of sales and MarTech, right? That's kind of what I sell. That's what I'm used to selling. So for me, I have to understand what all of those different motions look like from the SMB mid-market enterprise level, right? And so you have to understand the business as a whole and a core. So that's probably kind of really 50,000 foot level, I think, of what kind of like is the difference a little bit between SMB and mid-market and enterprise type selling. In a kind of a nutshell a little bit. But I think the one big thing is knowing where you are when you're talking to an enterprise company is you have to really truly understand where they are in that buyer's journey, right? Are you educating them? Do they have a problem? Is it a priority? what are the different components of them as a business? And then you have to understand kind of certain things around like their culture, right? Like how do they buy? Like are they completely siloed? Do they talk to each other? Are they on the same mission? These are things like as an enterprise, when I'm looking at an organization, when I start trying to have specific conversations and I start looking at the enterprise, I start going like, okay, if I'm going to go and I'm going to talk to this enterprise, like what are the key components that I need to know? And are they willing to make introductions? Are they trying to solve a problem? Where are their blockers? Where are their champions? Those are the different types of things as an enterprise that you're really, truly trying to understand. Where SMB mid-market, um, they're they're trying to solve problems, but they're not as big as they are as the enterprise. And there's a little bit of that I want to dive a little bit deeper into because enterprise organizations are trying to solve problems. They become a little bit more humble about it because they're like older and wiser, right? Where SMB mid market, they don't understand how big those problems become once they're a big, larger company, right? And a lot of times, I think when you're actually talking to these SMB mid market companies, it's being able to say, if you're selling the right technology, or you're saying this, hey, what's going to happen to you when you hit this size? How big is this problem to you going to be when you hit that? Do you need to solve that problem now? And then the enterprise organizations, what's happened now is like they've been around for 20 years or 20 plus years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 plus years in some cases. They've had these problems for a long time, right? And so you have to go and rip out these legacy processes or these legacy technologies or this technical debt that they've built up over time. And that's where I think it just becomes a little bit more of a beast in terms of like you being able to go in there and how do you uncouple that, right? So that yeah, I've said a lot, so I'll just stop right there. Yeah.
Wow, dude, so much wisdom there, right? So many things to unpack. Is there a specific like toolkit that an enterprise salesperson should have in today's market? Like, do you need technical requirements always in your back pocket or SOC 2 certification, documentation, those sort of things? So like, are those are those key things, and what are they, right? Are there like, and so in other words, like, is there a set of assets that you always need no matter what happens within a sales process with an enterprise?
Yeah, I mean, I think I always try to get ahead of this stuff in my earlier conversations that I'm having. I this is such an interesting question, right? Because I think when you say toolkit, some people might think technology. They go right to tech, right? They go, "Oh, what tech are you using on your day to
It
day?"
could be tech too,
It
right?
could be. Oh yeah,
Yeah,
no,
yeah.
absolutely. But and I think the SOC 2, I think, security, having those legal resources, being able to know that when you get to that period of time of when you need to pull out like the security and the legal and have that muscle when selling into the enterprise is super important. One thing I think that, when I think about like resources in general, it's they always talk about enterprise sales reps as being the quarterback, right? You are the person that runs the deal. You know how to like pass the ball off or throw the ball off to the right person. And I think that when you think about the people around you, is how do you know how to use the people around you at the right time? And that could be, whether you're using, your marketing team for collateral. How do you make sure like, hey, I've got this deal? Are there customer references? And then you got start to dive a little bit deeper between, kind of your solutions team. Hey, do you have the right solutions person? Is that person going to be able to answer these questions? If they can't answer that question, how do you pull in the right engineer or the right technical person around those different components, right? So how are you constantly making sure that you've got those right resources and those right tools at your like disposal, like when you need it? And I think that's navigating those enterprise organizations with those different components to be able to bring them in at the right time is really where it comes in, like where you can become super powerful as an enterprise rep, right? And it is about knowing how to leverage the right people at the right time, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's getting ahead of it too as well. So
Getting ahead of it. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Getting ahead of it, anticipating it, being several steps ahead of prospect or prospects, I know there's buying committees generally all the time, one of the unique attributes of enterprise. And I know that we've been saying buying committees are involved pretty deeply, even in smaller type organizations these days, but certainly something that has always been a key attribute of enterprise selling. James, thank you so much for sharing all this wisdom. I know we could sit here and talk for hours, but any sort of final thoughts, if you're a sales individual out there, sales pro, who is thinking about, boy, I need some tips to crush my numbers and get these big deals done. Any final tips that you would give folks?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, the one thing I would probably say that is, sometimes in enterprise sales, time is your best friend, right? Is they say time kills all deals, but knowing where they are in that journey and whether it's time to educate or time to attack, I think is really, really important, right? Because sometimes you can have these initial calls that can be really, really powerful, but you don't hear from them for 6 months because that's not a priority. They're just doing their due diligence. They're just trying to be educated. They're trying to be educated. They've heard about you somehow, through the grapevine. It started to bubble up internally. They've had it in internal meetings where it's like, yeah, your product keeps coming up in our internal meetings, and they just do like this educational type, conversation, or maybe a few meetings or something like that. And so it's really important to understand how to educate at those specific times. And then it's really important to understand when it's time to attack. And I think that's really, really, really something I think that I think about when I'm talking to people, and gives me a lot of peace sometimes, right? When I'm, like before I used to stress out about a lot of this stuff. And now it's like, okay, wait a second. Like, how do I identify where they are in that specific buyer's journey, where they are with me? Like, and I don't want to piss them off, right? I don't want to be that dick, excuse my language, but that's kind of what I think about when I think about, the advice that I look at, or when I talk to even some of the younger sellers, is even in the SMB mid market, is they tell me about calls, or they tell me about things, and I'm like, it sounds like they're in the more educational phase than they are in the actual buying phase. And I think that's really important to understand where people are in their buying process. So
awesome. Well, I know that everyone on this podcast has been an expert within the go-to-market profession or function, and also the audience members are largely go-to-market professionals. So maybe we can talk a little bit about LeanData here before we wrap up, just for these folks to understand how they can leverage it as a tool.
Yeah, no, I mean, wow. I mean, I think I came back to LeanData, right? And I'm pretty passionate about the product and what it does. I think LeanData as a solution, right? I look at it as more of a kind of a Salesforce automation solution at this stage of the game. We've really kind of broken down all of those barriers inside of Salesforce to allow people to really basically take advantage of Salesforce the way they need, to make sure their data is moving in the right place, to make sure everyone has visibility, right? And so when people think about that
orchestration too,
that orchestration, right? That orchestration is, how do you make sure that, all of the right people have the right visibility, and making sure that you get those notifications and those alerts to the right people at the right time. I think that's really kind of the key component around what LeanData is doing now, is basically bringing that to life and giving business control, right, over Salesforce. And I think that's that business agility, the ability to be moved fast based off of all these different factors that have happened over the last few years. Like, there's so much that's happening. And now we're in an election year, right? It's like we've had COVID, we've had this downturn, we've got an election year. Things are just kind of constantly changing on the flip of a dime. And so how do you as a business have control over your data? Because everybody talks about data. And I think that's where LeanData comes into play, is it really brings that data to life to allow you to make sure that you've got the right controls over what's happening. So
awesome. Brother, good to see you. Thank you so much.
Cool, brother.
For the folks out there, definitely connect with James on LinkedIn. I know you are sharing great content all the time as well. And check out LeanData. James, have a great day. Thank you so much, brother. Big hug.
You too, brother, man. Thanks a lot, man. This is my first podcast, so this is super
Awesome.
exciting.
Well, you crushed it, bro. And I love the plant back there. Have a good one.
You too, man.